Know that the air we breathe is made up of 78% nitrogen. It must be absolutely essential for life, right? Well, absolutely. Nitrogen makes up all living things' DNA, amino acids, proteins, and even enzymes. Nitrogen is really important. Oddly enough, though, we don't get the nitrogen we need from the air. So how do we get it? In this video, we're going to discuss the different types of nitrogen, what they are, and go over the nitrogen cycle. First, let's talk about the four main compounds that go through the nitrogen cycle. N2 is nitrogen gas that makes up most of the atmosphere. NH3 is toxic ammonia. NO2 is toxic nitrite. And NO3 is not very toxic and kind of wonderful nitrate. You've heard the water cycle. It's fairly simple. Water comes down, and then through a couple processes, water goes up. But on the other hand, the nitrogen cycle is a bit more complicated.
We're going to use the video from Super Science to help us explain the nitrogen cycle. You are made of protein, and nitrogen is required to make protein. And nitrogen is also required to make your DNA, which is your hereditary material. It's the code that makes you you, and it's found in all living organisms. So nitrogen is a very important thing that we need. Now, the source of nitrogen, or the major source that we have in our world, is the atmosphere, which is 80% nitrogen. It's the reason why the sky is blue, and it's actually only 20% oxygen. So we have a lot of it, but the problem is that most organisms cannot use nitrogen in its form that's found in the atmosphere, which is N2. Organisms need the oxidated form, which is known as nitrate, or they need ammonia, which is NH3. Now, so we can't get that from the atmosphere, so we need a cycle to create it for us so that we can use it. So the solution is that the gaseous nitrogen, or N2, needs to be fixed into usable forms called NH3 and nitrates. And this is the nitrogen cycle. The first step of the nitrogen cycle is known as nitrogen fixation, which is where we take N2, we convert it to NH3. And this is done mostly by bacteria that live in the soil or in the roots of plants. Now, lightning is actually responsible for a small amount of nitrogen fixation, but it's really a low amount compared to what bacteria do every day.
We'll start with nitrogen gas. Nitrogen gas has a triple bond, so it's extremely hard to break. Only a few bacteria have figured out how to break it down. These nitrogen-fixing bacteria take the nitrogen gas and convert it into ammonia. Ammonia can just sit in the soil until it's ready to be absorbed by plants.
The next step in the nitrogen cycle is nitrification, and it involves the conversion of ammonia into nitrites and nitrates, and this occurs in the presence of oxygen. It's a special type of bacteria that does this. Is known as an aerobic bacteria, which means it uses oxygen, and it makes nitrogen into more easily used form by most organisms. Okay, so you need to take your NH3, convert it to nitrite, which is a little bit toxic, and then it gets further oxidized, which means I add one more oxygen in it to make it NO3, which is a great form for organisms to use.
Or, nitrifying bacteria can then oxidize the ammonia into nitrites, which is NO2. Nitrite is kind of terrible. It's worthless. It's not super stable. Plants and animals can't use it, but bacteria can. So then more nitrifying bacteria oxidize the nitrites into nitrates. Now we have nitrates, and nitrates are wonderful. They're a very non-toxic form of nitrogen that can be used readily by plants or be denitrified back into nitrogen gas by more bacteria.
This denitrification process occurs in an area where oxygen gas is not present. It takes that nitrate, which could be used by a plant, but it isn't. Instead, it's used by a different bacteria that converts it right back to nitrogen, where it started from. And this is carried out by this denitrifying bacteria, which are known as anaerobic bacteria, which don't use oxygen.
Plants love nitrates, and they'll slurp that stuff right on up. Then, animals will eat the plants and finally get their nitrogen. Of course, that's how we get ours. But it's not over yet. Animals can excrete ammonia in their waste, and when plants and animals die, they decompose back into ammonia. And of course, the cycle is complete.
So there you have it. That's the nitrogen cycle. You got nitrogen that's found in the atmosphere, lots of it in the form of N2, but animal and plants can't use it. It's fixed by nitrogen-fixing bacteria into ammonia, NH3. That NH3 then can be nitrified to either nitrite or nitrate, which can be easily used by plants and animals. Denitrifying bacteria will turn it right back into nitrogen. We also know that animals, when they die or when they produce waste, release nitrogen back into the soil, which can upset the system. So let's take a look at what happens when we have too much nitrogen in our system. The system that I'm talking about is our ecosystems. When we farm or we have crops or gardens in general, what we do is we fertilize them to help make up for the missing nutrients in the soils. For example, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. We're focusing on nitrogen today. Well, what happens when we have too much? Excess fertilizers or excess nitrogen has a negative effect on the environment because it's not all absorbed by the plants. We put too much in, and what will happen is it gets dissolved in the water and it percolates through the soil into the groundwater and eventually through runoff. Because we live in a watershed, that water will end up in lakes and streams and rivers. And in there's plants. Algae and bacteria love lots of high levels of nutrients like nitrogen, and this creates something known as eutrophication, which is a buildup of nutrients in an aquatic system. And the problem with this is that the plants will really grow quickly because they have so much nitrogen. That algae grows up, and what you end up is you get a green area right here. This is the difference between eutrophication and no eutrophication. This has so much nitrogen in there that the plants are growing, and you might think this is great, but the problem is that as we have more plants, we also do more cellular respiration, which requires oxygen. So these plants, even though they do photosynthesis, they suck all the oxygen out of the water, and this can cause this can cause fish and other organisms that need the oxygen in the water. They die. And this is a result. If you go to Point Pelee and you see a lot of dead fish on the side of the water, that is probably a result of eutrophication. And if you look at a picture of Essex County, which I'll pull up right now, what you see areas in this zone here, right where we live, of this dark green. Now this is from runoff of whatever fertilizers that are going into the water, and this green is causing eutrophication of the lake. And this causes, you can see that lake area is quite shallow, and we have a lot of eutrophication happening here. We have blue-green algae growing because of all the fertilizer, this excess nitrogen that is getting into our water, along with phosphorus and other also fertilizers getting into our water. That's it for today. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. Thanks.